Morning. Can you hear me okay? So this morning we're talking about the period of the Judges, and particularly the story of Gideon. I'll start with a quote from Douglas Stewart. He says, "This period was generally marked by such practices as widespread idolatry, syncretism, social injustice, social turmoil, intertribal rivalries, sexual immorality, and other indications of unfaithfulness." We could think Douglas Stewart is describing our time period in history. No, despite its similarities to our struggles with idolizing materialism, racial injustice, social upheaval, and so on, Douglas Stewart is describing the period of the Judges, which ran from about 1240 to 1030 BC, starting after the conquest of the land of Canaan, soon to be Israel, and running up until the beginning of the monarchy. Today, I will first describe an overview of the book of Judges itself, its structure and general outline, and then we'll focus on the story of Gideon in Judges 6 through 8. And then finally, we'll look at some application points. So this period of social upheaval, when the judges were active, was marked by Israel's lack of faithfulness, as they all did what was right in their own eyes, in the oft-repeated refrain of the time period of the Judges. But it was also marked by God's grace in raising up the judges, particularly 6 major judges who subdue their oppressors and allow the land to have a rest prior to the next cycle of disobedience, oppression, then crying out to God, deliverance, and the rest. These 6 major judges are Othniel, Ehud, Deborah with Barak, Gideon, who's followed by the story of his son Abimelech, Jephthah, and Samson. So as the book of Judges progresses, this is we're going to look at more detail, so don't get overwhelmed. It's a little bigger for you, but not that much. It moves in a progress towards a climax and a moral movement toward a low point, a nadir. And both of these reach fulfillment in the Samson cycle. I think I have a pointer here. So, but you can't see it on the screen. That's interesting. Okay, never mind. But it starts on the left with an introduction in chapters 1 and 2, and then moves those 6 judges, major judges are that middle part in chapters 3 through 16, and then there's kind of an end in chapters 17 to 21. So Israel's relation to Yahweh, its enemies, and its own internal stability deteriorate throughout the book, reaching the awful narratives, this is 17 to 21, of idolatry, violence, Levite and his raped and killed concubine, the massacre of the Benjamites, and the attempts to restore Benjamin by kidnapping girls and young women at the end of the book. As disturbing as this account of what everyone doing what is right in their own eyes can look, it prepares the reader for the move toward the kingship and the need for a godly king who would point the nation back to God. But more on that later. So the story of Gideon. So this is our introduction in chapters 1 and 2, just to get a closer look, talks about the Canaanites and how God is trying to build a holy people, which then they end up joining in more with the Canaanite than they were supposed to and form a syncretistic Canaanite-looking people. And then chapter 2 sets up that cycle that we were talking about earlier, the spiral. Then this is the focus on chapters 3 to 16. And then Gideon is that, get a little better, is that second kind of full, it's the first full panel, the second column. So Gideon comes from the tribe of Manasseh. He's the first of the latter half of the major judges. So these after the first three, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah are the first three, and they're all good. Then it moves to Gideon, who's okay, and then to Jephthah, who's bad, and Samson, who's worse. So these three, the last three, have serious weaknesses and faults. Think of the life of Samson. And their focus on revenge accelerates Israel's moral decline. Gideon's story starts out in Judges 6 with a portrayal of the oppressor, Midian in this case, and of Israel's crying out to the Lord for deliverance. So in the cycle, oppression, so idolatry, oppression, crying out. However, the previous cycles, God doesn't deliver Israel right away. Instead, he sends a prophet who points out that they have brought this oppression on their own heads by worshiping idols. Into this context, an angel of the Lord comes to Gideon, greeting him by name as a mighty warrior and promising Yahweh's presence with him. Unimpressed, Gideon starts to complain about God's lack of action on Israel's behalf against the oppressing Midianites. Old Testament professor Daniel Block points out that the central issue of the narrative is this: where is God when you need him? Gideon is seemingly aware of the history of Israel and God's mighty deeds, but unaware of God's current standards for Israel's exclusive worship and Israel's failure to meet those standards. This makes it difficult for him to understand God's responses to Israel. The angel responds again that the Lord will be with Gideon, and he will strike down the Midianites. Gideon, still not convinced, asks for a sign that the angel would stay while he goes to prepare an offering. The angel does so, and Gideon prepares his offering. When he returns, the angel instructs him to put it on the stone, and he touches it with his staff, consuming it in fire and disappearing. Gideon realizes he was speaking with God and is afraid. God reassures him that he will not die. And Gideon builds the first of two altars to Yahweh. There are parallels in this calling of Gideon with Moses, his calling, his initial timidity, God's reassurance, being given a sign, and then the fire, theophany, that presence of God. Before he can move forward against Midian, however, Gideon has to oppose the enemies of God in his own literal backyard. God asks him to tear down his father Joash's altar to Baal and cut down his Asherah pole. We start to see this pattern of twos in Gideon's story. He tears down two altars. Here he's instructed instead to build a proper altar to the Lord on the site, with the bull that pulled down the original altar on as the sacrifice on the wood to burn of the Asherah pole. Gideon obeys, tearing down the two idolatrous altars to build his own second altar to Yahweh. However, let's not get confused that Gideon's being portrayed as a brave and loyal and obedient servant to God. The text tells us he does this at night because he's afraid. He's afraid of his family and the town. It turns out that this fear is justified as they come to his father the next day, demanding Gideon to be put to death. You get a picture here of how far Israel has gone. In the law, the punishment for idolatry was death. But here Israel is demanding the person who tore down the idol to be put to death. Joash replies that Baal can defend himself if he's really a god, and Gideon receives a new name, Jerub-Baal, let Baal contend with him. Gideon then moves to rally the troops to fight the Midianites and other enemies who have camped in the valley of Jezreel. The map of Gideon's story. I can't point it out to you, but you can see Ophrah, starts with an O and has a little dot next to it, has all the purple lines coming up to it. So that's where Gideon is. That's his hometown. To the west of him, you can see the valley of Jezreel is labeled. It's in the middle of all that green. And that's a very fertile place. The valley, so all the fertile soil has come down, and then it gets all the rain. So it's a very fertile place. And the Midianites were there destroying all of Israel's harvests. So that's where they're all camped out and where the battle will take place. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon. He summons allies, these different tribes that come in, Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. And they come. So instead of the expected fight and the God-given victory, now following this summoning, the narrative pauses instead for Gideon to put God to yet another test, asking again for a sign, another double pair of signs with the fleece. First, he asks for the fleece to be wet and the ground dry, and then he asks for the opposite. God graciously complies with both signs for Gideon. Gideon must have felt now somewhat reassured, but then God moves to make sure that he and Israel do not depend on their own strength. God, again, twice, reduces Gideon's army, first from 32,000 men to 10,000, who by sending home all who are trembling with fear, and then from 10,000 to 300 by only keeping those who drink water from their cupped hands like dogs lap. Gideon must have now been feeling very nervous again, as God invites him to visit the Midianite camp with his servant to hear what they're saying. There, just as Gideon arrives, he hears a man telling his friend his dream of a loaf of barley bread tumbling into the Midianite camp and overturning the tent, which collapsed. His friend interprets the dream. This can be nothing but the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites into his hand. Talk about a side. Here, Gideon seems to finally trust Yahweh. At the words of a Midianite, having failed multiple times to take God's own word at face value, or to take the sign that he himself set up for God to show. Judges tells us that here Gideon bows down and works, and then returns to his own camp to rouse his men, placing trumpets and empty jars in their hands with torches inside the jars to keep them covered. They surround the Midianites, and at midnight, these 300 men blow their trumpets, break the jars, and shout, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." There they stand, holding their positions, possibly even unarmed, since they had their hands full of these other things, as the Lord causes the Midianites to turn on each other with their swords, and then they flee. So their fleeing is the black line. They flee east and south down the Jordan. And Gideon calls the Israelites from the Allied tribes who he had sent home, or at least back to their camp, to pursue. And then he sends messengers into Ephraim. You can see Ephraim is the blue down on the bottom, the blue line, to come and help him. So they come and they're to hold the Jordan and keep them from crossing. They do manage to capture 2 of the Midianite leaders. They kill them. And then they meet up with Gideon and challenge him about his failure to call them to also help with the original battle, fighting Midian. He responds diplomatically, hearing them about their accomplishments and downplaying his own role, and they're appeased. But we see again kind of where is Israel at this point, that they're raising things to fight about and wanting to kind of cause this civil unrest. Gideon and his 300 men keep pursuing the Midianite kings, who are called Zeba and Zalmunna. Of note, God is not mentioned in this part of the narrative, raising the question of whether he is still enabling Gideon in this pursuit. Gideon crosses the Jordan and asks for help from 2 cities along the way. You can see their names there, Sukkot and Peniah. Both refuse. And Gideon promises vengeance on them for their doubting him. He appears to have completely forgotten his own lack of faith just recently. In the end, they're able to sneak attack the Midianite army. So the Midianite army is down there, you can see it in the south at Carcourt, and they come around that sneak attack with the orange and unexpectedly attack them. And in the end, they attack this army of 15,000. We find here in the text that they originally had 120,000 and more swordsmen, and they managed to capture the king. Gideon then comes back with the kings, fulfills his promises of vengeance on Sukkot and on Peniel, killing multiple people there in these Israelite cities, and then moves to kill the Midianite kings. And here we suddenly find the motivation for this headlong pursuit of Midian in the Transjordan, against all odds. The Midianites apparently were responsible for the death of Gideon's brothers. This is revealed just before he kills them. Gideon's victories raise the issue of kingship for the first time in Judges. The Israelites ask Gideon to rule over them. Gideon refuses, saying, "The Lord will rule over you." However, he also requests a gold earring from each person's plunder. There must have been a lot of plunder, because then he uses these gold earrings to make an ephod, a garment, which he places in Ophrah, in his hometown. And there, the text tells us it becomes a snare. Gideon and his family and all Israel, again, begins to worship an idol in Ophrah, reversing the good that Gideon had done at the beginning of the story. If Gideon's story starts out with parallels to Moses and his calling, it ends with parallels to Aaron in the golden calf. Jerubbaal, the name he was given when he tore down Baal's altar, turns out to be ironic, since idolatry remained supreme even during this judge's life. Despite Gideon's rejection of formal kingship, he goes on to live like an ancient Near Eastern king. He has many wives, at least one concubine, who is likely Canaanite, which is clearly forbidden in the law. He remains very wealthy, which is also forbidden in Deuteronomy 17. He mixes power and worship by situating the golden ephod in his own hometown. So what can we learn from this very mixed picture of a flawed, doubting, and cynical, yet surprisingly successful judge, at least in some ways? First, Gideon's story highlights the issues of faith and doubt. As I mentioned earlier, where is God when you need him? Gideon's story brings several barriers to faith. His of the law and the ways that Israel was breaking it in her sexual immorality, idolatry, willingness to hurt and kill their fellow Israelites, and so much more. And his lack of understanding of God's recent responses in Israel's history limit his ability to have faith and trust in God. Are there ways in which we ourselves need to be spending more time in God's word, learning his ways, hearing his heart for what his people's lives are to look like? Do we need more intentional ways of reviewing God's work in our lives, in the lives around us, purposefully remembering how God has responded when we call out? I don't know you, but I find God's responses to Gideon's fear encouraging to me personally. My friend Sarah Bollinger was reflecting to me recently that often stories in Scripture are more for what they tell us about what God is like than models for how we should, or in these cases, should not act in any given situation. For moments when I feel like Gideon and question whether God will ever act in a given situation, or whether he's trustworthy when I or someone I love is in pain, it's helpful to remember that God is still the same God with me as he was with Gideon. Patient, accommodating, somehow still able to empower me to act for his people's good in my moments of faith, however fleeting they may be, as in the case of Gideon, before I forget and start to seek security elsewhere. However, it's not only ignorance or doubt about whether God is trustworthy that hold Gideon back, as God clearly demonstrates in the story that he is trustworthy, repeatedly and patiently responding to Gideon's requests for signs, such as the fleece. Gideon himself also has to decide whether he will trust God when he hears yet again of God's plan to give him the victory. As we reflect on the story, perhaps you hear an invitation from God to trust him and to see him move in mighty and unexpected and maybe nerve-wrackingly uncomfortable ways in your life. And do we ourselves, like Gideon, have places in which we are bowing to idols? One of the commentaries I read suggested that perhaps one of our own culture's idols would be materialism. We see this in Gideon's story too. And it's a temptation to trust in financial independence and security rather than God. Or an idol could be religious pluralism, refusing to listen to God's claims to absolute truth and authority that can tell us what we must or must not believe, and therefore what we can or cannot do. Or the idol of self, which Old Testament scholar Ian Provan describes as emphasizing the pursuit of personal happiness and gratification, where we are given ever-increasing permission to ignore and, if necessary, to dispense with whatever or whoever stands in our way in this quest, be it life in the womb, children, husbands and wives, the poor, foreigners, or the aged. Like the call. Third, I mentioned earlier the issue of kingship. Much of Judges itself is set up to lead to the kingship, showing Israel's need for competent and godly leadership who would point the nation back to God and his covenant demand and lay the foundation for spiritual renewal. Clearly, Gideon falls short of this picture with his blood vengeance, his brutal retaliation against fellow Israelites, his golden ephod idol, and his covenant ignorance. But later, so does Saul, and then David, and Solomon, and so many others that follow, until the kingship is dissolved in the exile. And so we're left looking for a greater king. He is a king like the God portrayed in Gideon's story. Patient, merciful, amazingly accommodating to weakness, responsive to his people's cries for deliverance, even when they continue turning away from him to idols, time and again calling them back to himself. Jesus, as king, follows the guidelines for the Israelite king in the Deuteronomic covenant of Deuteronomy 17. Sorry, this is a little small. He doesn't acquire mass amounts of wealth or make his people return to be slaves to make him powerful. He doesn't take many wives or any, and his heart is fixed on God. He clearly knows the law of the Lord well and has learned to revere the Lord and follow the law carefully. He makes right social injustices, including the outcasts in his kingdom. He brings together tribal rivals, Samaritans, women, and Gentiles. He helps the doubter and does not reject him, calling him instead to himself, whether it's the father of the possessed child who says, "I believe, help my unbelief," or his disciple Thomas. He calls people away from idols, whether made by hands or our own work or idols of self in our hearts, to worship the true and living God who acts on our behalf to rescue us from oppression, as the judges did, but ultimately by coming himself to rescue us. In his kingdom, we don't all do what is right in our own eyes, but instead we submit to what is right in his eyes. and how much better it is to live in the kingdom of this King.